Okay, guys. So, chapter 16, Imperialism. I'm probably going to have to put this into two different parts because I don't have enough time right now to do the whole thing. But, new imperialism. And let's just go to the map right away because this is at one point was the extent of the British Empire. New imperialism, more than anything, I think, besides the spread of capitalism and the spread of democracy as a political system, has shaped the world today in ways that we are still trying to understand. The countries of Africa, it takes until the 1970s to fully get Africa independent. The countries in Africa, most notably Angola, right, which the Portuguese the Portuguese finally let go of in 1975. I mean, the ramifications of imperialism for both good and bad, for development, what's called modernization theory, right, with the theory that like the entire world needs to kind of get up to the economic, political, social, infrastructural level of the West. These have lasting ramifications into our time period and have caused these ideas of that, you know, the entire world needs to be on the same level of the West have caused significant the term that political scientists and historians and people in foreign policy like the CIA and MI6 and all those people, they call it blowback. They call it blowback. This idea of, historically, imperialism and other incursions of the West into places like Iran, Iraq, the Middle East, especially Egypt, that this time period has, since the new imperialism onwards, it has bred this resentment. It's I don't know why that happened. It has bred this resentment in certain countries that we can point to, you know, fundamentalism cropping up in response to Western incursions. Okay, so just keep this in mind because this is really, really important, and this is kind of right in my wheelhouse because this is what I did all my graduate work in. So this is kind of like one of those topics that is really, really close to my heart, and I really feel passionately about. So we've discussed that this is the new imperialism. It affects the Ottoman Empire. We'll go to this one, right? It affects the Ottoman Empire, Africa. You know, America is, it's pretty much the United States' ball game. The Americas, North and South America. The United States is pretty much trying to exert its influence over this Western Hemisphere. Europe, it's about Africa, it's about the Middle East, it's about India, and it's about Asia, right? China, Indochina, which is French, later Vietnam, the Dutch East Indies, which is Indonesia, right? Sumatra, Java, and of course the United States has the Philippines in 1898 as resulting from the Spanish-American War. But this is all about integrating a world economy on one platform, that is capitalism, integrating a world civilization on one standard, that is the Western standard, right? The Western standard of what being civilized means. So essentially, remember back to the gapminder.org piece, right? This is the world bifurcated into rich and poor, developed and developing, Western and non-Western, modern and not modern. Okay. So I think this map is great at kind of zooming in into India. Remember that there was still a mixture of formal and informal imperialism in India for a long time. Like, these are the princely states where the British have made deals with the princes, and the princes are administering these territories, and then the pink is where the British are more formally controlling. Remember, we've talked about after 1857, the Sepoy Rebellion, that changes. But you know, these maps are great, I think. Here's a map of Africa, right? The Nile River. Here's the Suez Canal. Here's German territory blocking the British dream of the Cape to Cairo Railroad. French presence, Italian presence in Libya. They don't get there until 1914. Okay, the Italians get in there late. But you can look at these maps anytime you want. I love this map. We'll look at this later. But especially, you know, notice the predominance of British influence. The darker gray, Saudi Arabia. Okay, south of Persia, and right here, right down here, is a place called Abadan. And Abadan becomes the world's largest oil refinery. Remains the world's largest oil refinery into the 1960s. This is controlled by the British. And this part up here is controlled by the Russians. And this is just to reiterate, remember the idea of exporting capital. The British especially are exporting enormous amounts of capital, right? And any kind of exporting capital, you know, investing money in these places, it's all about, that's all informal imperialism. Informal, indirect, you know, trade, the flag follows trade. Not trade follows the flag. The flag is following trade. Like, there's a lot of invested money. And there's invested money in the United States, which I think is significant. And this is just the exports, right? And steel exports. Like, we've seen this before. Okay, I think we've kind of got a grasp on what formal versus informal imperialism is. But informal imperialism is essentially, I mean, we've covered this before, but I mean, it's economic influence, it's political influence, it's but it stops short of full control, right? Formal is total full control. And I wanted to, I know there's a lot of writing on this page, but I wanted to just introduce you to this. One of the most famous papers written on imperialism is called The Imperialism of Free Trade by Robinson and Gallagher in 1953, and it's the Imperialism of Free Trade thesis. So I just wanted to try and go over this just because it's I think it's important, not for the test necessarily, but for your general understanding. Remember how free trade, the idea of free trade, remember, and I mentioned this back down here, remember the repeal of the Corn Laws, 1846, when Britain basically is like, okay, we're now dependent on free trade, you know, we got rid of all the tariffs on corn, on wheat coming into the United Kingdom, so we're dependent on free trade. Robinson and Gallagher sought to kind of explode this idea that there was a big consensus among historians before this article was written that imperialism declined in the era of free trade, which was basically like, you know, 1850 to like 1880. You know, there were historians were like, yeah, imperialism wasn't really there. But Robinson and Gallagher are the guys that we can kind of point to and say, well, they were like, no, actually, free trade, the notion of free trade was actually used to further the empire in more surreptitious ways. And I will let you read this whole thing on your own time, meaning like pause it and read it so that you get a better sense. But I will just point you out, just because I don't have much time, I'll point you out to one thing, right? They said, Robinson and Gallagher said, right? Look at investment. Investment was predominantly located in the informal empire between 1815 and 1880. Over $1 billion in credit, or £1 billion, had accumulated abroad, but no more than 1/6 was placed in the formal empire. Even by 1913, less than half of almost £4 billion of foreign investment lay inside the formal empire. Most was informal. And I raised the question in that other slide, right? How much money, how much British capital was coming to the USA? A lot. This helps to explain one of the things that Churchill will say later on when he's visiting the United States and gives his famous Iron Curtain speech. He says that there is a special relationship between the United States and Great Britain. And you can make your, you can make your own arguments, but this is my argument. So, take it as you will. Moving on. This is an actual excerpt from Robinson and Gallagher's article, and I think the thesis of their article is right down here. It may be suggested that this willingness to limit the use of paramount power to establish security for free trade is the distinctive feature of the British imperialism of free trade in the 19th century. And their basic point is that it's in contrast to the mercantilist use of power used to obtain commercial supremacy and monopoly through political possession, meaning that this new wave of new imperialism was fundamentally different than the absolutist regimes of the 17th and 18th centuries. So just it's a really important. So read this on your own time. You just pause it, read it, see if you can try and figure it out. Because if you can, like, you're ahead of the game. Like, this is me trying to challenge you guys to, like, look at graduate level type of reading and see if you can figure it out. So that's all. Moving on. J.A. Hobson. Now, Palmer talks about J.A. Hobson and his socialist interpretation of, in 1903, socialist interpretation of the new imperialism. Hobson, along with Lenin, right, the guy who leads the Russian Revolution in 1917, they think that the growing progress of capitalism will intensify imperialism, and they hope it will be the last gasp of monopoly capitalism. And it's classic socialist argument, right? Benefits only the bourgeoisie elite, therefore it can't last, that people will get fed up with it. But they, of course, fail to point out that the increased standard of living for all, at least all Europeans, maybe not Leopold's Congolese, that's what I said, in addition. But they basically say that the reason for imperialism, right? How do we explain imperialism? That's what I'm asking. They basically say that there's too much accumulated capital and in these capitalists' pockets, right? It's burning a hole. They want to spend it. They want to invest it somewhere. So they basically say it's a basic socialist critique of capitalism. It's imperialism caused by capitalism. Okay, so on the one hand, it holds water. On the other hand, it's socialist, right? So we have to take on the one hand, on the other hand. Now, Joseph Schumpeter, who who's writing after World War I, or at the end of World War I, is more liberal, and he kind of is a little bit more nuanced and a little bit more accurate. He thinks that the growing progress of capitalism will erode and in the end destroy imperialism, meaning that capitalism will make it unnecessary, that capitalism will make imperialism, mostly what they're talking about is formal imperialism, because they haven't yet gotten to Robinson and Gallagher nuancing everyone's understanding of imperialism as being very informal because of capitalism. I think that's where Robinson and Gallagher kind of bridged the gap between Schumpeter and Hobson. But that they think that once the world is capitalist, essentially, once the globe becomes capitalist, there's going to be no need for imperialism. There's going to be no need for formal control of a region. Now, I wonder what Schumpeter would think of the invasion of Iraq in 2003. But I digress. Sorry, that's just me commenting. Um, so Schumpeter sees other factors behind imperialism, not just accumulated capital and capitalists needing to invest it, right? He says, this is a direct quote, history shows us people and classes who desire expansion for the sake of expanding, war for the sake of fighting, domination for the sake of dominating. It values conquest not so much because of the advantages it brings, which are often more than doubtful, as because it is conquest, success, activity. He says that imperialism is an atavism, meaning that it is vestigial. That is a vestigial structure that once the world becomes capitalist, there's going to be no need for it. That is a vestigial structure of the absolutist monarchical state. And you can see how Robinson and Gallagher kind of say that too. That it is that there's basically saying there's always been some kind of imperialism, that pre-capitalist imperialism was different than this version of capitalism. This version of imperialism, and that I think this quote up here parallels the thoughts of Freud, Darwin, that humans are driven by animalistic instincts, that humans are driven to expand for the sake of expanding, to fight war for the sake of fighting. So I think that Schumpeter is this is I remember having to write papers about Hobson versus Schumpeter and Schumpeter versus Hobson and how Robinson and Gallagher bridged the gap. So I just wanted to present that to you guys. Maybe someday if you're in graduate school, you'll remember this and you'll say, hey, wow, Mr. Lear-Nickum had no idea what he was talking about. Or maybe Mr. Lear-Nickum knew a thing or two. Who knows? I have no idea. Okay, so again, modernization theory, right? Everybody needs to be where we are. Obviously, motives, there are altruistic motives here, right? Christian missionaries trying to make lives better, right? In the DBQ that you did, that document by George Washington Williams, he was a missionary. And when he tried to illuminate, when he wrote, if you get that DBQ out, it's the document 6, when he wrote an open letter to Leopold II, when he described the soldiers connecting batteries to their hands and then like shocking the people, he was pointing out like, hey man, that's not cool. But there were, and he's a minister. My point is that like George Washington Williams was a minister first and foremost, and he was trying to make African lives better. Another motivation for imperialism that we have talked about is the idea of, hey, let's create jobs for all these working classes, especially after the 1873 Depression hits, and lots of people get laid off. And as you know, bourgeoisie classes and middle classes are going to be like, hey, we don't like the working classes. We especially don't like the working classes when the working classes are not doing anything and not working, because when working classes aren't working, they get angry. And when they get angry, they might riot or they might create a revolution or something. So let's send them abroad. Let's give them jobs. So here's a nice little propaganda piece. See the world and get paid for doing it. Right? So that's one of the reasons why imperialism becomes so popular among working classes, because it creates this like it's something to do. It's a way to make a career. Churchill makes a career out of being in Africa. I mean, Churchill is in one of the last cavalry charges in Africa, like kind of those glorious cavalry charges that people that people got involved with. I'm sorry, not that people got involved with, but that when they get into World War I, they look at all the previous wars of the last 100 years and they're like, oh well, we won that war by doing a cavalry charge, and so why don't we do a cavalry charge? And they're like, oh, the other side has machine guns, that didn't work. So another reason for empire, you get more men for war. specifically in World War One, the Gallipoli campaign is a lot of Australian and New Zealand soldiers, right? The Anzacs, Anzacs. Um, so it's kind of nice. The empire needs more men, and the lion is always that's the symbol for the British Empire. The British Empire is, and Great Britain is always symbolized by a lion. Um, so that's another motive, just plain and simple. Um, okay, let's see here. I gotta get pages turned. Um, you know, imperialism is such a difficult topic to cover because it raises so many questions, right? I mean, like, how much benefit did the Europeans bring to the territories they controlled, and how much did they interfere with native attempts to modernize by themselves? Um, we talk about paternalism. Was European paternalism racist at heart, or did racism arise as a justification for economic exploitation, right? I mean, did people really believe in white man's burden, or was that a justification, and how much did one influence the other? Um, I mean, you got guys like Joseph Chamberlain, who was in your DBQ, the British statesman. Britain should be a great self-sustaining and self-protecting empire. Here we go with the imperialism of free trade thing, like bind the empire together as one big tariff union where there's free trade within the empire, but nobody else can trade with the empire. And it's he's like national security, and in an age of competition, right? He's all about empire. So there's a lot of questions. Oh, this was white man's burden. Here's Uncle Sam, The White Man's Burden. Apologies to Kipling. This is by Judge, 1899. Here's the UK, India, right? I mean, look at all these. I mean, it's the United States has Cuba. I mean, it's just an example. Oh, here's civilization up here, right? On the golden throne. I mean, this is just propaganda. But I think it's important to show you. This is one of those. It's actually a satire. This is a satirical advertisement. The first step towards lightening the white man's burden is through teaching the victims virtues of cleanliness. Pear's soap is a potent factor in brightening the dark corners of the world. As civilization advances, this actually was a piece of propaganda, a satirical propaganda. Here's another one. Here's the white man's burden. Civilization, the white woman, right? I mean, this is just I don't need to show you any more of this. Okay, I want to go through chapter 16. Let's see. I mean, there's all sorts of there's more stuff that I could say about why the new imperialism happened when it did. We could talk about Christian missionaries being attacked, anti-Christian attacks, whipping up imperialistic fervor. We could talk about scientists needing new places for research. We could talk about wealthy Europeans loving to travel to exotic places, and of course we could talk about all those goods that Europeans had become dependent on. I guess I can just go back to this one time. Coffee, tea, oil, rubber. I mean, oil is going to be a huge factor, and I'm going to get into that in another lecture. But the need for new markets, sheltered markets, neo-mercantilism. I mean, we've talked about this. We've talked about this a lot, so I don't want to belabor the point. But there was a significant portion of the people in these countries, right, that really did believe that there was a white man's burden, that they really needed to civilize these people for their own sakes, and I mean, there were a lot of benefits that imperialism did bring to the mother countries, right? Real wages went up. There's more jobs. I think the long depression would have been way worse had imperialism not taken place. Okay, and just so you know that Rudyard Kipling wrote White Man's Burden for the United States in order to try and support the United States in its efforts to become an imperial power after 1898, when the United States started to infiltrate the Philippines, Cuba, right? But a lot of people did see this as a crusade, right? That Europeans were more fit. The Germans called it culture. In the French, it was mission civilisatrice, right? But essentially, it all means the same thing. Okay, let's go back to let's try and talk about a little bit about the Ottoman Empire, and because the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire is incredibly important. So just to illustrate how the Ottoman Empire had become westernized and how Western influences were creeping into a predominantly Islamic territory, especially in Turkey. Let's go back. We have maps down here. But this is Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, right? Very old Islamic influenced design, right? Very, this could be right out of kind of Crusade era, 1000, 1100, 1200, old Ottoman Turkish architecture and design. Compared to this is Dolhambache. I don't know how to pronounce that. I apologize. Palace in Istanbul. That is like straight out of Vienna. That is straight out of Vienna. That is like Austria all the way. All Western civilization. Like, you could see Mozart playing the harpsichord in here, no problem. So just as a illustration of westernization. So here's 1878 Ottoman Empire, Balkans. Okay, here's Austria-Hungary, Russia, and here's the Ottoman Empire, what they're holding on to in the Balkans. Okay, and really, what it's coming down to in this time period is, that we have to see this. We have to see the Ottoman Empire as part of imperialism. We have to see the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire as part of imperialism. Austria wants more territory in the Balkans. Russia wants more territory in the Balkans. Russia is especially influenced by Pan-Slavism, meaning that they want to unite all the Slavic peoples, and there are lots of Slavic peoples that live in these areas. So this is 1878, and this is kind of where this is when the Russo-Turkish War happens, and the Treaty of San Stefano. But we're going to get into that. Okay, so basically the critical question is, what caused the manifestations of the weakness of the Ottoman Empire in the late 19th century, and how did the Turks try and deal with it? Okay, so really it's a lot of this comes down to this guy, Abdul Hamid II. He ruled from 1876 to 1909. But remember the Crimean War? Remember the Crimean War? 1853 to 1856. Okay. After the Crimean War, the Turks basically say, oh, okay, yeah, we got our butts kicked in that war. We're gonna have to do some major reforms. Those are called the Hati Humayun. I guess that's how you pronounce that. But basically, the Turks still rule the Balkans, right? A majority are Muslims, but there's a lot of minorities. We know that. The minorities had rights with their own laws, their own courts, but they paid higher taxes. So that's always that always kind of sticks in the minorities' craw, like the Serbs, the Christian Serbs, or the Catholic Croats, and Europeans had, especially the French. Remember the classic alliance between France and the Turks. France is always in this area. The French give several loans to Serbia. The French are all up in here, and several other European countries had residents in the empire who had exclusive legal and trading rights, trading privileges. These are called capitulations. Okay, those capitulations, they were able to operate in this area, which is a very rich trading area, with autonomy. But remember, the Crimean War exposed critical weaknesses, led to these Western reforms, and we have to view the Ottoman Empire as the sick man of Europe, right? These non-Turkish territories up here are being little by little being removed from their control, right, over the course of the 19th century. Remember, Greece became independent in 1829, okay? And just a refresher there, they rebelled once, and then the Turks crushed it, and when the Turks crushed the rebellion, like slaughtering thousands, Europe got all upset and saw Greece as this, the cradle of democracy, right? Like hearkening back to all these old times, and so they fought for Greek independence. Serbia had become independent. Romania had become independent. The French are obviously involved financially in this area, and they also are in this time period involved, as we know, in North Africa. And the French actually are kind of getting into Saudi Arabia and other parts, but they're partial to the Ottomans, which is interesting that they team up against the Ottomans in World War I. So, I'm sorry, I just lost my place. Okay, after the Crimean War. Oh, that's what I wanted to say about the French. I apologize. The French, because of all their financial investments here, when this area kind of goes ballistic, that will help them want to. That was the connection. Their financial investments here actually like prompt them to not be on the Ottoman side, because they want to see the Ottomans dissolved so that they can just deal with everybody independently. They don't have to deal with the Turks anymore. So it's another one of those like long-standing alliances that crumbles before World War I. Okay. So after 1856, remember these major reforms, right? After these major reforms, they basically like create Ottoman citizenship, equality before the law, separation of church and state. There's like campaign against corruption, creation of newspapers, and they help. These creation of newspapers obviously help promote the circulation of free ideas. This helps create nationalism in Turkey. Turkish histories are written. Foreign, as I said, foreign loans come in even more to help build a railroad system. And then when Abdul Hamid comes to power, he initially reinvigorates. Let's go back to him. He initially reinvigorates the reform campaign when he comes to power in 1876, but he quickly reverses that, and then dismisses the first Turkish parliament that met in 1877, and then rules like an autocrat for like 33 years. But that prompts the Young Turks to rise, and the Young Turks will eventually achieve success of independence for Turkey. But the important thing here is the Russo-Turkish War. Okay, and I just wanted to bring this up because this is kind of like Bismarck's last final great stand. So this right here, this star right here, that's called the Bosporus. Okay, and Russia has always wanted, and these are the Dardanelles. These are the Dardanelles. This is the Bosporus, and this is where the Gallipoli campaign will happen in World War I. This is the Bosporus. The Russians have always wanted control of the Bosporus, not just because it's a geographically important area, but because Russia always wants to control Constantinople. Why? Because Constantinople was historically the seat of their religion, their Eastern Orthodox Christian religion. That's where Constantinople, that's like since the time of Constantine in like 325 AD, that's when Orthodox Christianity was really founded. So that they always want to control Constantinople. They would love to control this area. They not only do they want a warm water port, but the fact that Turks, Muslims control this area is kind of like sticks in their craw. Like they would love to recapture Constantinople from the infidels. So they basically, because of there's a Balkan insurrection. There's a Balkan insurrection, which this is we can go over a little bit in more detail. But there's an insurrection in Bosnia because Vienna occupied it, and this prompts Russia to invade. Because basically, like, Russia's vying with Austria for this territory, right? Makes sense geographically. The Ottomans quickly fall to the Russians, and then they ensure the independence of Serbia and Romania, and then they give autonomy to Bulgaria. This is Bulgaria. Now, Russia wants a big Bulgaria, but they really only get a small Bulgaria, which is created at the Congress of Berlin, which we'll talk about in a second. Essentially, the British are scared because they don't want the Russians to control this area because of the Suez Canal, right, protecting their empire. That's when Disraeli had bought all those shares from in Egypt and gotten full control of the canal, and basically there's two things to this. There's the Treaty of San Stefano, which decides Romania, Serbia, and Bulgaria, and Vienna will end up controlling this area right here, and then there's the Congress of Berlin. So here's the Congress of Berlin, 1878, right? Bosnia, Herzegovina, that's where the insurrection was, and Austria used that insurrection to invade and control Bosnia and Herzegovina. Russia used used Austria's excuse as infiltrating this area. But Bismarck says, okay, this is bad. We need to call Congress to kind of settle these issues and avert war, and he does. So modifications to this Treaty of San Stefano occur. Okay, so Britain got Cyprus, okay, which is key strategically over here. France goes into Tunisia. That's not really that important. But Austria gets control over Bosnia. That's gonna later on in Sarajevo at the cause of World War I, right, when Franz Ferdinand is visiting Sarajevo. That's gonna create problems. Bulgaria, parts of Bulgaria stay in the Ottoman Empire, but going back to that other slide, right, there's like, Russia wanted a big Bulgaria, they only really get a small Bulgaria, and the Ottomans still administer it. But the Russians do get this area below the Caucasus Mountains. So that's a win for them. Um, and let's see what else happened. Germany doesn't take anything for themselves. Bismarck doesn't take anything for themselves, but Germans get the right to build a Berlin to Baghdad railroad. I think I have, the Berlin to Baghdad railroad. Berlin goes through Vienna, goes through Bulgaria, goes through the Dardanelles and the Bosporus, goes through Turkey, and goes all the way down here to Iraq, to Baghdad. This is a huge deal. And the big takeaway, and let me see what this slide was. Oh yeah, the Congress of Berlin's Bismarck's last great triumph, question mark. And remember that Bismarck was satisfied with German success in territory at the end of the Franco-Prussian War. He was not a fan of colonies or building a German navy. That's going to be important later on. But the Berlin to Baghdad Railroad, I mean, you can see why at the onset of World War I, it's Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Turkey as as allies. Yeah, this makes sense. Because when war breaks out, Turkey sides with Germany. It eventually, of course, loses all its power. The Ottomans lose power to the Young Turks in 1908, and then Turkey becomes a republic in 1923. But Turkey will be a part of the Central Powers. Okay, and yeah, this is incredibly important. The Treaty of San Stefano and the Treaty of Berlin, which is basically the Congress of Berlin, not to be confused with the Berlin Conference, which is where Bismarck establishes the rules for the scramble for Africa. But the Congress of Berlin, 1878, will establish a fundamental link between Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottomans. Okay, that's going to play into World War I. Here, I have to stop because I just have to stop. We will get into Egypt and North Africa when I return, and then we will go through Africa, then we will go through Asia, and then we will be done with, and finally the Russo-Japanese War and its consequences, and then we will be done with Chapter 16. So, until then.